Welcome back to another episode of Fireside Adoptees, our Adoptee Fire Speaker series that is open to the adoption constellation here. And we're excited today to bring a really special interview with two people that have been really significant for me and for other adoptees in terms of the stories that we get to tell to them and the way we get to interact with them. And that's Sarah Reinhardt and Louise Browne, who have this wonderful podcast called Adoption, The Making of Me, that has been very well loved and received in our community, something that I think a lot of people are excited about an interview like this. It gives us a chance to talk about the uniqueness of each of your stories and also the fact of how you came together to produce something that's been so helpful for a lot of people in our community. I wanted to just really quickly give an introduction to each of you that will then be followed by more expounding from each of you about your stories. But both of you were adopted at birth. I know, Louise, you were born in 1968. Says you were adopted into a loving home near Denver a few days after birth, and you knew from very early on that you were adopted and had wondered about your birth parents. And Sarah, you were born in the baby scoop era in St. Louis and found out.
Both of us were baby scoop era. Let me just interject.
Yeah.
I was not adopted at birth. I was in foster care for the first month and a half.
Yeah, and so was I. Yeah. So thank you for exactly that time. So thank you for clarifying that for me. And you had some things you discovered about New York City that will be interesting to talk about really quickly in here too as part of your story. But I wanted to start by giving each of you a chance to talk about your stories, about your adoption stories, because I know you've told them individually. I've listened to how each of you interviewed each other on Adoption, Making of Me, and I've heard other forums. And yep, I like the laughing about this because it kind of makes me chuckle too. And I think there's a big starting point for this here. But let's start, Sarah, with you telling a little bit about your adoption story, and then we'll go to Louise.
Well, I know my whole adoption story because I met my birth mother after I had my son. You know, like many adoptees, wanted to find out who I was and where I came from and medical stuff. And so I met her in 1998, just in like right around this time in 1998. She and my father met in college. They were both at Valparaiso. She was 18, he was 19 or 20. And it was like a New Year's Eve conception. And then when college, she told me she knew she was pregnant. I wonder if she actually did, because she didn't try to find him until after she gave birth, and by then he had been drafted into Vietnam. Side note, I just found out about 2 weeks ago that, and I've known my aunts and cousins, I have been in touch with them, his side of the family, for years now. And I only just found out 2 weeks ago that he committed suicide. That's how he died. He had really bad PTSD from Vietnam, like saw his whole platoon killed and was in the hospital for a long time. And then he tried to manage his life for many years and it just caught up with him. But she never could find him. So he never knew I was born. The reason why I think maybe she didn't know she was pregnant was she only gained 7 pounds. She never had a prenatal appointment. And she was on a plane. She was on a plane from New York, where I was in utero for all of her pregnancy in Queens. And she was on a flight out of JFK with her mother. My birth mother was also adopted. So she was with her adoptive mother, who was older, like I think 40 when she was born. So at this point, probably in her late 50s, early 60s. And so no one knew she was pregnant, and her water broke on the ascent from JFK. So she spent the whole flight in labor, landed in St. Louis, and gave birth to me. So that's the beginning. And then I went into foster care, and then adopted with my adoptive parents, and taken to a small town like 2 hours away from St. Louis. Fish out of water for sure once I started getting older and getting a sense of who I was. And then they adopted another child, my brother, like less than 3 years later. And then when he was 4 months old, 5 months old, discovered they were pregnant with twins. So it was 2 adopted kids, 2 biological kids. And then when I was 7, they got divorced and my mother left. So then I was raised from that point on. I mean, we would see her like every other weekend, but mainly we were with our dad. And then he got remarried when I was 12. So there's a lot of other stuff in there. A lot, but those are the bones, the skeleton, if you will.
You just made that discovery recently about his suicide.
2 weeks ago.
Wow. So you haven't even,
yeah.
That must be a lot to be processing and reflecting on. Wow.
Yes, I was going to reach out to my brother, my half brother. We've never met in person, but he has a lot of his own trauma due to our father's PTSD as he was growing up and how that manifested. So he has a lot of unresolved trauma. And I think talking to me or anyone else in his family triggers him. So I don't know what he knows. He never did tell me, but so I'm kind of weighing that.
Yeah. Real quick before we move on to Louise, I heard what I often hear, and you probably hear it many more times than I do, which is once an adoption happens, there tends to be unexpected fertility sometimes in families. It sounds like that's what happened for you in your case.
It is.
Yes. In that case, yeah. So how about you, Louise? Would you like to tell a little bit about your adoption story?
The skeleton bones of mine. Hi, everybody. So I was adopted right at birth, 3 days. I just recently found out, like Sarah, maybe 2 years ago, that I was with my biological mom for several days, actually. So maybe about 3.5 days. She relinquished me on her own accord. However, as we know, that is very, she was 19, had very little resources, family without money to help her, a lot of visits from a social worker. So I don't know the full story of everything with her because she tragically died when I was in the 2nd grade. So I don't know her, but I've learned and pieced a lot together about her through her family that I am reconnected with, and just through old boyfriends of hers and the love of her life that was with her when she died, type of thing. So I have learned that, it was very traumatic for her. I never really knew that until recently, because 20 years ago, my biological family found me. I didn't search, they found me. And it was a particularly hard time when they found me. I was going through a lot in my first marriage and having my own son, and he was just a toddler. A lot of things bubbling up just from giving birth to him, as many of us know when we have our first child. And so when they found me, I dove into that, but a little bit unprepared, obviously, for reunion, which we can talk about later. How I came to be adopted in Colorado is my adopted parents had a son, my brother, who's my adopted brother. He's their natural son, 5 years older than me. And they had another little girl that was a stillborn baby that my mom delivered, had to carry for 3 months after the baby died, deliver her. I recently just found out her name, in fact, right before my mother was dying, my adopted mother. And because that was like unspoken. I never knew that that's why I was adopted. And my brother never knew. He was too young to remember that. So, I was a healing Band-Aid for that issue. They wanted a little girl. And I do think I was pretty close to my parents. I had a great home growing up, but there was that disconnect with my mom and I that I could never put my finger on or figure out. And I was rebellious in my teen years and always the black sheep. I look enough like my family. I had a really loving family, but I was always a fish out of water, So that is my basic story. There's of course more, but I'm sure we want to get on.
It's interesting because with all the chances you get to talk about your story, that each of us thinks, okay, I know this about myself. I know this. And then always things coming along, aren't there?
Oh, and I have, so Sarah mentioned her biological father. My biological father is alive. I know who he is. And I've reached out to him. We had communication last year for about 3 months during the summer. I have 2 half sisters, which that's why he and my biological mom, when they were high school sweethearts and she was younger than him. So he, like Sarah, it was a New Year's party type thing. We're both born in September. So there's the math on that.
Mhm.
And he already had someone pregnant that he was marrying. So I have a half sister, 3 months age difference than me, and another half sister who don't know I exist. He's the oldest of 7 sons in a very large family. So I come from a small family in my adopted world, and I have this massive biological family, and none of them know I exist except for him. So I was speaking to April on here. Hi, April. I'll probably be kind of pursuing that, I think, coming up, to reach out to my sisters, because he's ghosted me at this point. And I'm not sure why, because of health or his own fear of like 2 worlds merging. So that's that on that side.
Yeah, thank you for that.
I wanted to quickly say, I too was adopted due to my parents had had a miscarriage pretty far along. I have a long letter that my adoptive mother wrote me. It's very difficult to read. But also that my birth mother did not want to relinquish me. They wouldn't let her hold me. I was completely taken away from her without, she did not want to give me up. So of course, that's an important piece.
And I think in my case, I also was adopted to fill a void from miscarriages and the desire to have a boy in the family. I had 2 older sisters. Can each of you talk a little bit about how you felt about being adopted growing up? I know we just talked about the fish out of water, but at what point did you really start to think more about, I'm an adopted person? Was it something you knew for a long time that you wanted to talk about it?
Sarah, you go first.
I mean, I knew as far back as I can remember. It was told, like I said, I have a letter. Actually, I didn't get that letter till later, but yeah, it was presented like a wonderful thing. I mean, I think many from that era had the same story told to them. You were, very fortunate, and so I didn't think much about it, except in, I want to say, maybe 2nd grade, 1st or 2nd grade. I went to a really small parochial, 1st through 8th grade school. And I had like the same group of 30 kids, except for one who might be held back. And then another one would be held back that would come in, but basically the core group of kids. So we were all, knew each other really well. But at one point, I remember somebody said we were on the merry-go-round, well, you were adopted, and I punched him.
Oh yeah.
Like making fun of me. So, but then it just never, I had so much other secondary trauma, like the divorce and so much stuff, the remarriage of my dad, my mom moving to Florida. There was so much other stuff that it got convoluted. The original trauma was lost. But that said, I had run away from home, and then I was in Florida with my mom, and it was the 80s. What can I say? I had a cocaine dealer shove an NA book underneath my apartment door with a note saying, I really think you could use this. So I got clean and sober at 20 back then. And then I went to therapy, and I knew at 20 years old, I knew there was stuff going on, and that I had issues, but I think I paid a lot of lip service to I remember kind of being not necessarily lying, but being withholding in my therapy sessions and never really telling anyone the whole truth of never really showing myself to probably anyone for many, many years. And knowing that that's what was going on, and, you know, and would say to people, oh, I have abandonment issues. I was adopted, but I didn't really connect to it, you know?
Yeah.
So yes, does that
Yeah. That was
answer
really
the
good.
question?
Thank you.
I had Sarah speaking, it's made me cry a little bit. Yeah, I had this sort of similar, different than Sarah. We had similar childhoods and different childhoods. I had stuff bubbling up in my teen years with boyfriends, right? The relationship stuff. And, you know, I had some molestation with a neighbor next door. I was probably an easy target, you know, that kind of thing. And so when I went to therapy, it's funny what Sarah was saying, it's kind of jumping, but I did that too. I sort of picked and choose what I would tell my therapist at that time. Like, I'm not going to show my whole self to somebody. I didn't do that. That's what the problem was in my relationships. With certain deep friendships, I did much better with like guys and sports and the boys in the neighborhood, my brother's age, right? I couldn't do the deep relationship thing. And I thought, oh, I'm just really weird, you know, and I don't want to show someone that. If I tell this lady how weird I am, then she'll see how weird I am. So it's almost like I was hiding with my therapist, who never did ask about adoption. She knew I was adopted. So of course they didn't even go anywhere with that at the time, but I never related it to abandonment issues. I just thought there was something wrong with me. And, you know, growing up, it was, you know, the special message, you're special. In fact, you know, we had such the I'm special message that I think my brother got the opposite feeling if he's not so special, which affected him now that we've talked about these things, which, you know, he's a kid too in the situation. Everybody's being told whatever story to fit the narrative. And I think, you know, I pushed it down. I was a pleaser in my family and not a pleaser in life. I was rebellious out in the world, just like my biological mom. We're so similar. I was kind of wild and nobody knew why I was so wild and was always trying to do something and go somewhere and sneak out and all sorts of things, right? But at home, I was quiet and the pleaser and tried to be funny and fit in and just the chameleon, you know, watching all the time. And how can I fit in with these people who are all really similar? You know, as most families are, our adopted families, when you look at them, you know, I can blend with my family, but they're all so similar. They're all so, you know, Baltimore and St. Louis, East Coast and Midwestern Germans. And I'm like, you know, I didn't know what I was. I just knew I wasn't them, but I tried, you know, so that's kind of long and short of it. That's funny what Sarah said triggered another memory. I was like, oh yeah. We spend a lot of time talking together about these things. And I still find out things about her and we've known each other quite well and I still find out things.
I think that adds so much to this dynamic of why I wanted to talk to both of you at the same time. It's for that reason. Look, you did it right here. Right now, something came up like that.
Yeah.
What do you?
Well, because we're talking to other people, right? But we don't. Yeah.
Yeah, you get to bounce it right off each other directly right here. The experience of becoming mothers was important for each of you. Would you speak a minute about that? About how that changed?
Well,
you thought about reunion and finding family.
We know each other because of we each have a son, and we know each other because of their school relationship. And that, you know, both of us are very attached to our sons. And I'll let Sarah speak first. We'll keep going in order.
Well, I just wrote I'm in a writing workshop and I just wrote an essay about my empty nest because it was so profound. Like I said, I didn't show anybody myself. I recently have been in touch with a boyfriend that I lived with when I was 20. We lived together for about a year and we found each other after all these years. And we're very good friends now, and I feel very comfortable with him. But he told me, he said, there was something that I would look you in the eye and you couldn't do it. You would turn away. And I never had heard that from anybody before. I was always so busy running away. So I didn't, it wasn't until I had my son when I finally felt a connection to a person, a human. I hadn't had that connection before. I never felt a connection. I had dramatic relationships. I had good friends, that friendships, actually, I didn't have that issue that Louise talked about. I had a lot of close women friends. It felt different somehow, but this was the first time I ever connected to another human being. And from that point on, I just dove into, okay, it's my job to be a better parent to him than I was parented, to give him more love and support. And so that's what I did for up until he went to college. I focused completely on him. So that then when he left, it was, and his father and I had split up when he was, I don't know, 7, I guess. So, I mean, he would see his dad. He wasn't an absent father, but it was the two of us for all these years. So that when he left, I was lost. I mean, really, really lost and in deep grief. And I didn't know who I was and what to do with myself. And it kind of it was in conjunction. The first couple of years of college, he'd come home. So I would, okay, he'll be home for fall break. Then it's winter break. Oh, great. Then he'll be back for summer. And, I was still doing that thing of living my life for him. And it wasn't until January of 2020 and he had a girlfriend and he was in his junior year of college in Dallas, and he had a girlfriend, and he called to say, well, I'm going to do an internship in Dallas this summer. So he wasn't going to come home. And then of course, COVID happened, and it was just really, and I left my home of 30 years in Los Angeles and moved to Kansas City, and again, like lost, and I was drinking a lot. And then Louise and I started the podcast, and everything it slowly started to unfold and make sense. And I kind of tried to start healing that stuff, and I still, I talk about this in the essay I just wrote. I still I'll go see my son every few months in Dallas, and I still count on that, but it's not the way that it was, if that makes sense. I kind of think that maybe that wasn't so healthy for me or for him, I think he must have, there must be there are repercussions of being the child of an adoptee who isn't aware that those are the issues that are ruling your life, and so we talk about it. We definitely talk about it.
Where do I relate to that about what you can do to your kids? Yeah. How about you, Louise?
I have similar with that situation with the, I feel my first husband, I won't out him on YouTube, but he has his own abandonment issues that he's working through, and different than adoptee issues. But I think we're forged together. That's why we got married, because we had these things. Neither of us had any clue what was our deeper stuff. So I feel that when Sarah and I were reading The Primal Wound at the beginning, that's the book we started with on our podcast. And for those who don't listen to our podcast, we read a book, a section, and talk about it, and then interview a guest. I felt like I was reading, about my child, and I was like, it was such generational passed down. I actually had 2 parents who really modeled, my adopted parents very much modeled a pretty healthy relationship and all this. And I thought, oh, I know how to do this, right? I'm going to be this great parent. I was a teacher. I'm going to be amazing at this. And boy, was I wrong, right? passed down all my stress and anxieties, and we talk about it too. That's something, that's the nice thing of having adult children that you're close to, is that you can start to talk about these things. And when they go through problems, say, listen, I contributed to this and I'm sorry. And it's good to see someone and talk about it and all these things, because I think that's the thing I was missing in my home life, was the ability to say what's wrong with me. Is more like, yeah, what is wrong with you, as opposed to let's find out, right? And let's stop things from starting. So, you know, when he was born, it was the same as probably a lot of you have been through. It was like, don't let this baby out of my sight. I had no idea I was going to feel this way. I just could, you know, I couldn't even go on a date with my husband without calling home 100 times and all of it. So I'm sure it was not healthy for him in many ways. I would be a much different parent now, of course, and have a lot more boundaries than that. We do the best we can. I'm really proud of who he's become, and who's Sarah's son too. I know, I'm lucky to know him. They're wonderful boys, and we're just, I feel like that's where, you know, maybe that's where all of this is going. Because like Sarah, when we started this podcast, it's like everything started to come about for us, and that's helpful with the second part of our lives, I think, in parenting and grandparenting, hopefully one day, and having, you know, the wisdom now to be like, okay, you know, I didn't know then, but I know now. So that's
So you two kind of really did meet on the playground, but I think it was the playground for your sons, sort of. What
we met playing, well, we met on the playground with our sons, but we really hung out playing pool.
okay.
I'd like you guys to know that we were playing pool one night for hours, and like, you know, you do the whole I'm adopted, oh, I'm adopted.
That's
And then
what I
all
was
of a sudden it's
wondering,
like
how that how the initial conversations, if you even remember them, what it was like.
And our
that
friend
was
that
awesome.
introduced us was suddenly the third wheel.
I saw this friend yesterday and she was like, you and Sarah. Was like instant. I'm like, I'll just go home now. Yeah, we had a connection anyway. I mean, I think part of it, we have a humor connection and just some funny, you know, we just bond. But it's funny. We bonded about being adoptees, but we didn't get into any deep stuff about it often. We just both knew we had some issues.
Yeah, we would talk about it on the truck, but
yeah,
not in the way we talk about it now.
No.
Just almost again in that like I talked about earlier, you know, in a detached kind of way, like an intellectual way. Oh yeah,
intellectual way.
I push people away because I'm adopted, but it wasn't like, you know, ha ha.
Right.
I
think we had grace for each other, because underneath we both knew there was something we have to be kinder to each other than, you know, because when you're running a business together, you get into stuff. Like we've been through a lot, Sarah and I, and we still come out okay. And I think it's because we have sort of now we really understand each other, but even back then we had sort of a grace for each other that you wouldn't have maybe with other people, because you're like, okay, we're both as messed up as each other. We just couldn't nail it on, you know, you can't put the exact hammer on the head for it.
Before we talk about the podcast, so I've had this experience, but I want to know if you would talk about. There was a point where Sarah, she said she went to Kansas City, and you two were pretty inseparable, right up until that point. What kind of feelings come up when an adoptee moves out of state for you, Louise?
We weren't, well, you know, we had COVID. So here, I'll give you the trajectory. We had a business together. We became very, very close. And then we survived that. That's how I look at it, because when you have it's not like we just had a business. We had a food truck on the streets of LA.
Yeah.
Very intensive.
Old truck that would break down. And I mean, it was stressful.
Very stressful, and lots of fun stories, but really a lot of work and not a lot of money and a lot of time. And, you know, so we stayed friends, which to me was like amazing. And then we got closer through COVID again, talking on the phone, because that's all you had. I remember taking walks in my neighborhood in Woodland Hills and having these great conversations with Sarah, being like, I wish we had something else we could do together, you know, like, but now it's COVID, and then she chose to move to Kansas City. So I also moved. So we were both in Los Angeles, and I moved 3.5 hours north to the San Luis Obispo area. So we both moved. So I was kind of bummed she was moving in the way of like, this is my LA buddy. Like but we were both moving, and there was so much shifting parts in the world. It wasn't like we were like working together and then she moved. COVID really had a lot of for all of us, right?
And it had been a few years since the business had sold.
Yeah.
Louise had gotten married. Sarah
was at my wedding. Sarah was at my wedding.
So it wasn't like two 22-year-old besties, it was I don't think you felt abandoned by me.
No, I didn't feel abandoned.
I was interested in that.
I'm going to bring that up on the next podcast.
I have felt that way over somebody who moved away. So I didn't know if anything like that might have happened between.
That does happen for sure. I mean, I think we bonded more because we both moved, and she was in a really precarious newer situation. I could still drive down to Los Angeles, and I live with my husband. She really was like forging a whole new territory, being back home with like, you're now in the Midwest. It's COVID's coming out a little bit, and you're with your whole family, adopted family.
Well, and I was with my adoptive family, and also step family. So I was kind of Cinderella in my step family.
Yeah.
I mean, really, truly, like there were two sisters, and so it was just like triple fish out of water. But I moved here closer to my son in Dallas, which is really the truth. And then, my adoptive mom lives in Kansas City, and my dad and stepmother are like 2 hours away. But I moved here thinking, here's this family. And again, not super mindful about how it might feel. And then we start the podcast, and I, come out of the fog.
Yeah.
And then I'm like, wait a minute, who are these people? I don't know them. They don't know me. This is bizarre. It was all those kinds of feelings like, this is not my home, the Talking Heads song.
Yeah. And I had just lost both my parents. My adopted parents both died pretty young, and sort of not, kind of shockingly. And so I was in a new area. So the two of us were just kind of like, our first season doing the podcast, like every week was really a big thing for us. I think my husband thought, who the hell have I married? Because like sad girl going around and talking to, he's just like, wow. Luckily he's still in there though. He's hanging in there. He's excited to have Sarah come out, because it's going to be a whole cool thing, the three of us together. So
I think this type of interaction is what so many people enjoy about your podcast. In addition to getting to hear the stories of adoptees, is you two work through things right there in the presence of the listeners. And I hear it. I hear the discoveries being made, the connections, the synapses firing. And it's obvious, and you've both admitted it kind of in a humorous way, that when you started, you were in one place, we'll call it the fog. And at some point or gradually over time, you were not there anymore. And I can't help but wonder, when you started the podcast and you had these views or these opinions or these thoughts about your own adoptions, about adoption in general, do you remember what those were like and how you felt suddenly confronted with all these other adoptee stories? Why don't we start with Sarah? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Sure.
Start with Sarah.
Yes. It's more like
I like when we start with Sarah always.
Sarah, you introduced this person today.
I do that to her all the time. You do it.
I know you do. So this is good.
I don't know how I felt about adoption, because I was told certain things about it my whole life. And anytime I've ever told anybody, I'm adopted. I'm thinking of it. Actually, somebody the other day said to me, I've been trying to have a baby and I can't. And just some stranger in the dog park, when I said I had a podcast about adoption, it's automatically assumed that I think adoption is a wonderful thing. And B, that it's okay to say, yeah, I really wanted my own baby, but now I'm thinking of adopting. This is literally the words she said. So I think I played into that for many, many years because I didn't know any different. And the adoptees that I did know, like Louise or my other friends, again, were told you are much better position. Your parents were you should be so grateful, or all those things that people said. So I think I really I didn't touch on it. And I've talked about this a lot on the podcast that I wish I had been more open-hearted with my birth mother. But, she died before so I just kept her at an arm's length. So that was kind of a space, really just never had read any books about it. Never talked in a deep place about it to anybody. Didn't really know how I felt about it. Just was pretty out of my body when it came to that. So that when we did start the podcast, it was like, oh, let's just have people on and we'll have anybody in the constellation. We'll have, hey, you have an adopted brother? Come on and talk about it. And then as it went on, it was like this unfolding of, oh, this is a whole other thing. This is weird. Adoption is weird. Like that was more and more it's weird to think about taking a baby from its mother. Like you don't like dogs have to stay with their mother's puppies for, 8 weeks before you can get the puppy, but not a human, I'd never thought about that before. It had never even occurred to me. It's wild. In my 50s before that ever even crossed my mind.
I had the same thing as Sarah. Really, I do think it's funny. At the beginning, we had these guests on. We had different, Constellation members on, and I learned from them too. I think what Sarah and I both learned, because everybody was lovely that we had on, but we learned really quickly that we need to be here for adoptees because our issues started coming out, right? So it was like, as we're getting into our issues, one thing I really realized, I think like Sarah, I didn't know what I thought about adoption as an industry, but one thing I realized is I was pretty messed up, but I had a really good adoption, as you say, good adoption, bad adoption. So meeting all these other adoptees, I'm thinking, holy cow, what people have been through. And I went through that sort of thing. Am I the person to tell their stories, or to be the person am I okay to be a person that does this? So I think one thing we're very cognizant of is that when we have a guest on, we just want them to tell their story and no matter what their story is, right? And be kind and truthful to that story. And I learn something every week from these guests. Sarah does too. We interviewed someone this morning and we were both very emotional about it. And about this person we had on because it affected us. And I think that's the learning. And we still get comments. We had a friend recently said, oh, you should have on, well, how come you guys don't have on the adopted parents and the okay, because they don't understand, right?
You should. Have you ever? That was more of a. Have you ever thought about having
we get the same. We get in business, we hear, we'll be talking to someone, oh, adoption, and people just assume it's a positive narrative, and I don't know why they wouldn't assume that, because that's what's portrayed in books and Hollywood, and the reunion story is the end. Oh, how wonderful and how great this all worked out. And we know that that's just the start. So I think that we're learning as we go. Maybe that's why the podcast is popular, because we're learning as we go.
That ties in really well with something that you've said here about that I feel as I'm interviewing people, and I will have people say to me privately, do do you think my story is important enough to tell?
Mhm.
You must hear that all the time, or have people come to you like, do you think it's okay for me to tell my story? How do you respond to people who say those things?
Well, even getting on here today, we all make apologies for ourselves instantly, right? Like, oh, I don't look good, or I'm not, this is the typical adoptees are always this way. All of us, like, are we worthy type of thing. And so we do, I think when people come on, the people, we don't ask people to come on, right? They ask to come on. So they're ready to tell their story. And we've had
Season
a few
1,
people.
we asked people.
We literally asked everybody we knew. So that's true. Well, come on, you want to come on, don't you? And but now I think people don't come on unless they want to come on to tell their story. So, and they have a story they want to tell. And we have had people change their minds, and we've said, that's fine. You're not, all of a sudden they get uncomfortable or nervous about who may hear this. And it's out in the world. Once it's out in the world, it's out in the world. So
It's out there very public. How about you, Sarah? How do you feel about that question when people ask about, is my story important enough to tell? Do you feel like they approach you with that kind of posture or something?
Well, everybody's story, this is like something I've learned as a writer, just everybody has a story in them, and that story is important. But I don't, like Louise said, mostly people come to us. There is very few, only a couple times where someone changed their mind. I think when they finally reach out to us, they're ready to talk and tell their story. And I think because of the way we have it set up, since we're not asking people, they're coming to us, they're ready. They've gotten to that. They've reached that point of being ready.
Yeah.
And hopefully they've listened. I think other guests, not Sarah, we're not taking all the credit. They've listened to other guests we've had people say, oh, I listened to guest so-and-so, that story, and that helped me. Oh, so I want to tell my story now. Someone mentioned Jim Serrano in one of ours, that his story helped what he thought. And so I think that's where we learn from, is each other, right? That someone else's story, we don't know who's telling their story, that could free somebody listening in some other place that we don't even know. That's what's so fascinating. Like this, what you're doing, Greg, it's the same thing.
I feel this.
I will admit,
Yeah.
I will throw this out there. I got interviewed for Damon's show, and I was in a bad place when he interviewed me. It was almost a year ago, and I was really having a lot of issues with my adoptive mom. And I was brutally honest in the podcast, in that interview, and I changed my mind. I thought, she's still alive. My dad is still alive. I don't want that to get to them somehow and be pointlessly hurtful at this late age. So I was somebody who, it wasn't because I didn't think my story was not important. It was because I just didn't feel okay with hurting them for no other reason than I was mad at that moment.
Yeah, and I can relate to the wondering when I've been on podcasts, wondering afterwards, going back and hearing and thinking, what did I do any damage that I didn't intend to do?
Yeah.
So I feel like it comes up all the time that I'm thinking that, going back.
Oh, every time we podcast, it comes up for me, and I think, okay, I'm going forward.
It gets to be this dance of authenticity. You want to be true to your story and yourself.
Yeah.
And you also have this need in you to try to preserve something or someone's feelings, so I completely relate to how that plays out. And hopefully
I think as Sarah said, it's about also, there's times when we're really angry, you read something, you get angry, or but at those times, you're not always feeling that way every day about somebody, right? So it's like, to be hurtful in that way, because I think we're pretty authentic now about, I'm kind of like, if someone in my family blackballs me or something, that happens, that's going to happen now. Okay. And I don't think anyone listens, to be honest. which is fine. But if they do, they do, and it's okay, you know. But I think what she's saying too is just, you know, there's things that you say when you're angry about something that maybe isn't the day to say it, right? To anybody. So, and we've had guests say that too, like, I'm going to hold off on what I said. Let's re-interview or whatever. And that's fine too. That's why we don't air live or anything. Not that we could, technology wise, we're still.
I'm like, huh? Is that
We run
right?
a tight operation. We try. Oh goodness. You guys could see the behind the scenes. It's kind of funny.
Yeah. I found in my case that there were adoptive family members listening to the things I was saying.
I mean, my adoptive mother listens to our podcast.
She's one of our Patreons. She's one of our Patreons. Yep. And she's really loving about it, but it's hard.
Yeah, again, it's that being true to yourself piece.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I wanted to thank you both very much. It's a really enlightening conversation. I've had a lot of questions, even though I've interacted with both of you for a long time now, and really appreciate the opportunity to have come on and interviewed with you. The interaction between the two of you has always been kind of magical to me to listen to and to see you go back and forth about it. So I couldn't think of a better way to capture that than to say, what if they both talked about it at the same time? And I know you were on board with that, and we appreciate the transparency there, because you've said these things that I think help a lot of us to figure things out as well along the way as we listen to your podcast, as we come to you for our own stories to be told. So thank you for making that a platform that's been so helpful for a lot of people. And really just want to thank again for the time and openness here. And I know it's been a while since we finally got this together, but it's been well worth the wait for me. And I hope it was an enjoyable experience for you as well.
So much so. And I know Louise feels the same. It's an honor to do our podcast. It really is. It can be intense and emotional.
Yeah.
But it's just, it's really an honor to do it and to be here. Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us, Greg. And for everybody joining, it's neat seeing people too that we see on social media or, you know, past guests. It's just
it's exciting, right? It's
cool. Yeah. We'll take a picture when we're together in person. I'm like so excited. That's why I told Sarah, we always have each other. We have family, you know, now. Yeah. And I think adoptees, when you reach out and have connections with other adoptees, we just started having a group up where I live, and April on here, she's part of that group. We met for the first time, and it's like, oh, I have a family in my town now, right? Instantly, it's different than if you met someone some other way. It's an instant connection. It's pretty cool. She's like, yeah.
Thanks again, and thanks also to everybody who came to watch the interview here, and to remind everybody that this will go up on YouTube, on the Fireside Adoptees YouTube channel, where you'll find other interviews that we've done. And we're excited to welcome you into your future with the podcast, to continue with the great work you've done. And we look forward to hearing more from Adoption, the Making of Me. Thanks, Sarah and Louise.
Thanks, Greg.